Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. My name is Aaron Espinoza, and I have the distinct privilege of being the director of the Library and Observatory as well as the Writers Festival. Oh. I got my fan base up here. Just a real quick reminder, please silence your cell phones. I said I was never going to be that person, and unfortunately at a dinner the other day, I was that person. For those of you that were not able to get a book, or if you want to purchase a book in the back, our partners at Follett Bookstore are selling the books. And then Victoria will be signing books at the very end. So for those of you that are interested in getting to meet Victoria, take a picture, get your book personalized, please line up along this side, and we will get that taken care of fairly quickly. We would not be here today without the thanks of our founder, Jamie Kabler. I also want to give thanks to our executive team who are not in the audience today, but Debbie Miller and Deborah Deja. They do an amazing job all year long, so thank you, Debbie and Deborah. And then to our amazing angels who are, some of them are sitting in our front few rows here, and then I know many of them are actually watching online from the comfort of their homes, wherever that may be. So thank you to our angels. The Writers Series is made possible by a generous donation from Jordan Snitzer and is funded by the Harold and Arlene Care Foundation. So thank you, Jordan and the Snitzer Care Foundation, for all your support. We are coming up on 3 more programs after today, and then that will complete our series of for the Writers Series this calendar for this season. So on Thursday, March 9th, this Thursday coming up, James Kirkchick in conversation with New York Times' Adam Nagorny, speaking about James's first book, Secret City, the Hidden History of Gay Washington. And then on Tuesday, March 21st, we welcome a veteran of 20 political campaigns and author of Any Given Tuesday, a political love story. Any Given Tuesday is written by Liz Smith. Probably I put Miss Smith here and not Liz. It follows her from her earliest experiences as a college-age intern to her days as a trusted advisor and confidant to some of the most high-profile politicians in our country. And we close our series on Tuesday, March 28th. My Life in the Sunshine follows Nabil Ayer's path from an unorthodox childhood to his current post as a top music executive. Son of Roy Ayers, this memoir is about one man's journey to connect with his musician father, ultimately redefining what family really means. I'm really excited about the final 3 speakers coming up, so please join us for those particular days. But speaking of fantastic programming, today's program, we're happy to welcome back Victoria Kastner, a Writers Festival alumni from 2016. Did anybody get to see her in 2016? Got 3 people. Woohoo! Well, just a shameless plug. If you did not, you can actually go onto our Writers Festival website in our YouTube page, and you can watch that presentation from Victoria now. So please join us on YouTube for that. Victoria was Hearst Castle's official historian for more than 20 years, during which time she wrote the definitive trilogy on its history, Hearst Castle, the Biography of a Country House. Her latest book, and the subject of today's lecture, is Julia Morgan, an intimate biography of the trailblazing architect. As a former commercial baker, she thinks nothing of whipping up a cake for 50 people. She always plans her menus by choosing the dessert first. My kind of gal. In addition to being an amazing writer and a baker, Victoria enjoys singing and still sings at her local care homes. Victoria states that writing the story of Julia Morgan's inspiring life has proved to be the most fascinating subject in her career. Join me and let's hear why in welcoming Victoria Kastner.
Hello, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. And I want to say thank you to Aaron and also thank you to Debbie. But this day, which I've waited for a long time, marks the end of a long journey. It was actually 2017 when I was at the Writers' Festival, just in case you do want to look online. It was 2017. And I was here to talk about, at that point, my most recent book, which was called Hearst Ranch, Family, Land, and Legacy. And what I was really talking about were the two places that Hollywood came, to get away from the rigors of the city. And they were, of course, Palm Springs and San Simeon, right? So I was at a party afterward and talking with Jamie in the kitchen of his beautiful home. And he said, well, Victoria, there's no biography of Julia Morgan. You should write that. And I didn't think I could. I didn't think there was enough information. I didn't think I was going to be able to do it. But Jamie dreams big, and he told me to do it, so I did. So Jamie, today is dedicated to you and Helene, and all of the wonderful difference that you've made to the lives of all of us here and all of us near and far. So thank you very much. So it was a labor of love, and as it turned out, once I got started, as is so often the case, and Julia Morgan was another dream big person, there actually was a lot more material about her life than I had realized, and I'd been studying her for 30 years, and her life was actually more difficult and challenging than I had ever suspected. So it became an extremely important thing to tell her inspiring story. I think we associate her with San Simeon, and of course she did work on that estate for 28 years. She was the sole architect, and that was from 1919 to 1947. It was job number 503 of more than 700 commissions. It got one number. Amazing. And she couldn't vote in a presidential election when she started it, So she really was so remarkable. But as I said, there's even more there than I realized. Her archive, I think the myth is, there are two myths about her. One is that she was a lesbian, and really there's no evidence of either way, but it's likely that what she really loved was architecture, because that's what she devoted her life to. Not that uncommon for women to remain single in the first part of the 20th century and focus on their career. The other myth is that she burned all her papers, and actually she saved an enormously large archive, and it's all located near where I live in San Luis Obispo. Cal Poly's libraries, the Kennedy Library Special Collections. So my assistant and I started transcribing after I went home from Jamie's, and we came up with 800,000 words, and of diaries and letters that she saved, and that material is in the process of being digitized. It's taking a little while, but it's all going to go on Cal Poly Archives website as the Julia Morgan papers. We're donating it, and then scholars from all over the world will be able to tell her story. So, Jamie, that's another thing you've started. But I assembled a team, and I was very fortunate to have Chronicle as my publisher, and this man, Alexander Verdikoff, as my architect, as my photographer. He does specialize in architecture photography, and he is an absolutely brilliant artist. And he spent a couple of months going up and down all of California, and he can make a two-dimensional photograph look three-dimensional. I mean, this is the Chapel of the Chimes, her columbarium in North Oakland. And I was blessed with my editor and designer. We all gave it everything, because that's what Julia Morgan always did, and what we knew she deserved. So I've told you, sorry, I'm going backwards. I've told you what she didn't do, didn't destroy her records, didn't have romantic relationships, saved her romance for her profession in architecture. But what did she do? Well, if she were here today, the first thing she'd probably say was she was a native Californian. She was born in San Francisco and lived in Oakland, and was very proud to be a Californian. She was the second of 5 children and the eldest girl, and she grew up in some affluence. Her mother, Eliza, I think, is where Julia got her spine. Eliza Parmalee Morgan was from a very wealthy family. Julia's grandfather had been a cotton broker in the Civil War. Eliza once wrote to Julia, who was off on a school excursion. She went to UC Berkeley. The stationary letterhead was inscribed Vincit qui partitum, which means he conquers who suffers. And she said, I hope you're having a good school visit. Let a spirit of duty animate you if you are inclined to droop. Well, Julia was no drooper, but she really did, I think, get her energy and fire from Eliza. Her father was very enthusiastic and dedicated, but not a success. Julia's sister's son, Morgan North, later on reminisced about his grandfather. He said he was into sugar, farm machinery, nails, voting machines, balloons. Whatever didn't work, he was in. So Julia was largely subsidized with a very comfortable upbringing by the maternal grandparents who lived in New York. She frequently spent a lot of time in Brooklyn Heights, but she went to Oakland High School, and this is the house where she lived from her 13th year. She actually lived in this house from 1887 till 1925, and it was a beautiful home. And because I had this, and it's now the on-ramp to the 980 freeway in Oakland, unfortunately. But there are similar Victorians that have been saved by it. But she grew up around beauty, and as I said, I had a brilliant research assistant, and Ruth was able to find. This is a line drawing of the Morgan family living room. It was in the San Francisco Examiner in the 1890s, long before Julia Morgan ever met William Randolph Hearst. That was his newspaper. So you can see it's got this feeling, lots of objet d'art, this library table with shelves for books, the diamond tile, very kind of arts and crafts or aesthetic movement, And because we found this, then we were able to identify this, and it's Julia Morgan's mother in that room, which had a partition across the back. So she's in the ante room, but you see the built-in bookcases with their fold-down fronts, all the art objects, the aesthetic movement, bamboo stand, and enough flowers and photographs that there are even some sitting on the floor, right? So she always grew up in beauty, and she knew she wanted to be an architect. Her second cousin had married a famous New York architect named Pierre Lebrun, and he became a mentor to Julia. But when she went to University of California, which she did, entered Cal when she was 18 in 1890, they didn't have an architecture department. She had to study civil engineering, and she did study and graduate. And there were a couple of women who had studied it before, but no one who ever used it professionally. And when she got out in 1894, when she graduated with honors in civil engineering, she met this man, and he was, maybe the ultimate dream bigger. This is Bernard Maybeck, brilliant visionary architect, and he came to the University of California. And Julia met him after classes, after she had graduated, but she was taking art classes in San Francisco at the Institute of Art. And he was, in spite of the fact that he was this very ethereal man who had an unusual wardrobe, his waistband ended just about an inch away from his armpits, and he wore unusual clothes. He was a dreamer, and his colleagues sometimes made fun of him and called him a freak. But he was very, very convincing to people, and including William Randolph Hearst's mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, who had been a young girl in Missouri who, at the age of 19, married the next-door neighbor who'd been gone for more than 10 years and came back, one of the wealthiest miners in America, George Hearst. He was 41, she was 19, and they came to San Francisco where their only child, William Randolph Hearst, was born, and a year later, so W.R. was born in 1863. So Bernard Maybeck, when Phoebe was widowed at the age of 47, George Hearst, who became a senator, died in Washington, D.C., and Phoebe approached the campus and said, I'd like to give scholarships and I'd like to build a mining building in my husband's memory. And they gave her over to the only architect on campus, who was Bernard Maybeck, and he said, well, Mrs. Hearst, that is a good idea, but don't you think it would be a better idea if you underwrote the design of the entire campus, and then we could figure out where to put the mining building. And she did. She did. It was she wrote a blank check, and it was the first international architecture competition. Now, because Maybeck was, advising her, he couldn't build on campus at that time, but he did build something tremendous for Phoebe Apperson-Hearst. And this building was at the base of Mount Shasta on the edge of the Oregon and California border in the forest, and it was called Wyntoon, Wyntoon. Looks like it was lifted right off the Rhine River, and 7 stories of height and all stone and slate roof, really dramatic. So that's how Maybeck convinced Phoebe Apperson-Hearst to dream big. The way he convinced Julia Morgan, he told her that she had enough natural gifts that she could apply to the finest school in the world for architecture, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the School of Fine Arts. It had been founded in 1648. It had never admitted a woman. And he had graduated from there, so he really knew what he was talking about. And he urged Julia, there was a rumor afoot that women were going to be admitted to the painting and sculpture divisions anyway. She graduated in 1894. So in 1896, she took off for Paris and started sitting in on the classes. And she was indeed the only one to do this. Women hadn't been admitted, but they'd gotten a literal toe in the door because they were told that they could audit the actual classes in architectural history and mathematics and things. So this is the Palais des Études, the grand hall for studying, through which Julia would walk every day to audit these classes. Now, in 1897, women were admitted to painting and sculpture, and the men rioted. They rioted. They chased these women through the streets. They were outraged, So it didn't even occur to anybody that there'd be an applicant for the architecture department. And what you did was, in order to pass these rigorous exams, you joined what was called an atelier, a studio. And she's drawn a little diagram of it. So there was an architect who came in maybe once a week to critique your work, but basically it was your people in their 20s practicing to get ready to take these examinations. So she's written where her office is. At the very top, it says stores, meaning, like supplies. And then it says empty, and then it says Bud in the middle. That was Catherine Budd, who briefly sat in on classes. And then it says me. That's where Julia's little cubicle was. But you see over here, this long corridor, that says men. And in order to get to the little cubbies, these girls had to run the gauntlet, go up those stairs, and through this men's domain. And in this letter, Julia said, one of them is very gentlemanly, but the rest could have been replaced with no difficulty. And there isn't a doubt she was definitely hazed. It was a long tradition of hazing. She had water poured over her head. She was pushed off the ends of benches. She was ridiculed. But she was serene through it all, and she adored Paris, and she couldn't have been there at a better time. It was the Belle Époque, the golden era, and just before the change of the century. And the place she loved the most was Notre Dame, and so she hated to have her photograph taken, but at least she posed for this one and sent it back to her family. So she's on the side there of the great cathedral. But what she loved to do the most was climb up to the towers and look at what she called the half-wicked, half-fiend gargoyles. And she said she liked to imagine what they'd seen over the centuries as Paris spread out and grew before their feet. And so it was a wonderful time to be in architecture. And I could give you an entire talk on just the rigors of her getting into the école, but just suffice it to say, it was hard. She took the exam, almost passed, and just by a whisker didn't. But then the second time she took it, she thought she'd done better. And she was quite crushed that her score was worse. Well, she found out why. The faculty had lowered her score artificially. And I don't think they would do that unless you were going to pass, And she said, it's kind of funny in a way, but I'll just take it again to let them know. They said, we don't want to discourage young girls. She said, I'll just take it again to let them know that the young girls are not discouraged. So eventually on that third, she took it again, was lowered. But on the fourth time, she actually passed these incredible difficult exams. She said, the judgment is in today only. I am 13th. it is not much, but it's taken quite a little effort. And she said, she called it a test of some way, you know. She said, of work itself, overcoming natural difficulties. She said, it just made it seem a thing that had to be won. Well, that was just the beginning of the hard work, and she lost more than a year by being, artificially lowered in her scores. So she was admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts in 1898, and so she was 26. And you didn't you took classes, but you didn't advance by grades. You had to enter competitions. They give you an assignment. This would be an assignment, design a palace in a theater. A theater in a palace is what I meant to say. So she'd have 12 hours to do a sketch like this, and then turn it in, go away for 6 weeks, and come back with the most elaborate drawings in plan section, and elevation. And if in any way your finished drawing diverged from your initial sketch, which she did not keep, she turned it in, you were disqualified. There were only 2 people who would win in the competition. They'd win either 1 or 2 points, and you needed more than 24 points to advance through the program. And one other thing, you had to finish by the time you turned 30. Most, Americans did study there, but often they didn't stay the whole course. And if they actually did go through the program, it took them 6 years. Julia had 3 years, and she did it. This was actually the final design that got her over the top, and it was worldwide news. It had been a big deal when she was admitted to the école, but at the age of 30, to her acute dismay, she was world famous. Her family were being besieged by reporters, and so was she, and it probably is one of the reasons why she really had an antipathy to being interviewed much of her life. But she came back to a very different California because Phoebe and Bernard Maybeck, the person who gave the money for the theater to be built as a way of honoring his mother's commitment to the University of California. We don't know if they ended up with 26 daily American newspapers and 14 magazines and wire service and radio stations. And so Julia's very soft-spoken. She's extremely diminutive, maybe 5 foot and a little, and yet they really clicked because he had been a world traveler and loved Europe and knew a great deal about architecture. And of course, so did Julia. And it could be that they met here. This was going to be W.R.'s country house. It was in Pleasanton, which is just southeast of Oakland. And it was on a horse ranch that his dad had bought, and he asked his mother, Phoebe, if he could build something there. She said, yes, just don't build anything very large. And this is what he built. The Hacienda del Pozo de Verona, the house of the wellhead of Verona, was the Spanish name. It got very grandly. Well, Phoebe arrived for an inspection tour. And clearly there'd been a discrepancy between their expectations because she confiscated it. She moved in. This became her house. And the W.R. never lived there. But the architect he'd chosen, Albert Cicero Schweinfurth, Phoebe continued to hire him, but sadly he died very young, a very young man in 1900. And when Julia returned from Paris in 1902, late 1902, Phoebe soon hired her to finish the work at the Hacienda. So we know that they were at some point to be introduced, and we know that the agent for this grand introduction was his mother. It was almost immediately that Julia started having major commissions, and I think people have also assumed that Phoebe paid for Julia's education. She offered to, but Julia turned her down. She said, "Your faith is enough of a gift of confidence in me," and but she did. She grew up in a upper class family in Oakland. She did have social connections, and this was her first great commercial commission. It's El Campanile, the bell tower at Mills, Oakland Women's College. These bells, there are 10 of them, they were at the Chicago World's Fair, the World for rescuing so many refugees. And a lot of them looked around and thought, wow, better weather, working utilities, don't think I'm moving back, So it was a good time to be an architect. And of course, she was, at that point, really the only female architect in California. There were others, there were many others, most of whom succeeded rather than preceded her. But no one who did this range of buildings. And we don't know exactly what it was that got her the commission for the Fairmont Hotel, which is what you're looking at here. But you see, this is it hadn't even opened. It was just a couple of weeks from opening. And it was gutted, absolutely gutted, because it was the devastating fires that did the destruction in the post-quake 3 days. And anyway, Julia got the commission. And what she was hired to do was re-engineer this building, which had moved 7 feet from its foundations, and which many people did not think was even salvageable. And one of the things she talked about, I wonder, you see these buildings here kind of in the central part of the photograph. She would work at night on the engineering calculations, and rats would jump over her feet as she worked. But she had to work outside for a long time until she could stabilize the building sufficiently that she could move her office indoors. And on the 1-year anniversary of the earthquake, it opened on time, under budget, the very first civic building to come back in San Francisco. And an enormous, it's really very impressive, and an enormous encouragement to these heartbroken and beleaguered San Franciscans, as you can imagine. So she was interviewed by a very irritating reporter, and who apparently was looking to see the newest hairstyles and fashion from Paris, and actually described Julia as a Quakerish young woman, severely hairpinned. You know, it would be enough to put you off. Call the First Bay tradition is kind of quintessential Northern California. Wood shingles, very simple. But even these, had Julia's particular sensibility. The lots were narrow, and the front door is actually halfway down the house on both of these examples. And that way, it maximized your privacy, but you could go into the middle of the house. The staircase is facing you. You've got the dining room on one side, the living room on the other. Extremely practical and lovely buildings, which are the pride and joy of Berkeleyans today. And the one on the left, she actually sold for $1 to one of her top employees after he lost his house in the Berkeley fire. This is not unusual. She actually gave houses to people. She was incredibly generous. But this is another building from about the same era, 1908, in Berkeley Hills. But it gives you the sense, it's this arts and crafts tradition, lots of built-in furniture, beautiful sense of handwork and artistry and craftsmanship. So she's known for such buildings, and always beautiful light cascading in. She built what CAs were so important for young women who were leaving their family farms and needed a safe place to live, and not a boarding house full of traveling salesmen, And this was their summer retreat. They would save money all year long so that they could spend 10 days at Asilomar. And Julia worked there from 1913 to 1928. And more than a dozen of her buildings still survive, and you can stay there. And they've done a beautiful job of maintaining it. So she was very adept in the arts and crafts traditions. But not only, she was also, I and others have used the term, skilled at the Beaux-Arts and crafts, because what you learned how to do at the École des Beaux-Arts was take the historic inspiration from the past, but use it in a technologically modern sense. And the thing that made Julia Morgan so different from her peers is that she didn't have a style. You couldn't just look and say, oh, that's a Julia Morgan building, and so is that, so, like you would a Frank Lloyd Wright building. She did what the client wanted, and that was a very broad brief. One of her clients in Piedmont, between Berkeley and Oakland, the lavish hillside community, showed her this watercolor. He bought it in England and asked her if she could build a house that looked like it. So I'll just go back so you can see again. The gables went from the left to the right, but she's got the brickwork, the oriel window, which is that obtruding window right over this arched doorway, the brick coining, beautiful, beautiful 10,000 square foot home in Piedmont today. But she would do whatever you wanted, even if your your needs were a little unusual. There was one man, he and his wife didn't like right angles, so she built a house for them that didn't have any. And another man who lived up in Northern California where it got very cold in the morning, and he didn't like to get out of bed to turn on the heat. So she created this little contraption that was fitted underneath the bed covers, so that he would get the room warm before he had to venture even out from underneath the blankets. So she was always interested in architecture and how it could serve its users. She honored its users, glorified whoever they were, and went from the most modest, of course, to some of the most lavish buildings. And she did work with William Randolph Hearst in the ensuing years before San Simeon and after they met. She built a bungalow for him on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. It's now part of the national park, but I mean, it was just a little more than half a dozen rooms, simple house. She also built, and maybe you're familiar with this one, the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner building. And this was 100,000 square feet. It's right down to foot newspaper factory plant. So she knew her client. She knew how involved he was. And when, in 1919, Phoebe Hearst died of something that we know all too well, the flu. She died of swine flu on the 13th of April of 1919. And California came to a halt. All the flags were half-mast. She helped found the PTA. She helped start the Save the Redwoods League. She built free kindergartens around the country. She restored all California's missions. I mean, she was just the most benevolent philanthropist. But she had owned the property that William's dad, George Hearst, the miner, had bought when William was only 2, and that was the ranch, which ultimately was 250,000 acres, precisely between San Francisco and Los Angeles, San Simeon. And one night when he walked into her office in San Francisco, he had a high voice, Hearst had carried, and one of his employees overheard the conversation when William Randolph Hearst said, "Miss Morgan, I'm tired of camping, getting a little old for tents. I'm thinking of building something more permanent." He promised her that it would be a 6-month project, right? So she worked on San Simeon for the next 28 years. But the astonishing thing is that she did hundreds of other buildings, at the same time. And it's remote, but the difficulties of getting there, and we know how many times she traveled down, 568 trips by train. She'd take the ferry from San Francisco to Oakland. She'd catch the train. She did it after work usually on Saturday, because it was a half-day work day at least in those days, in the teens and 20s. So she'd be all night on the train. She'd come into San Luis Obispo about 2 or 3 in the morning, and a taxi driver would be waiting there for her to take her up to San Simeon. That 45-mile drive took a couple of hours in those days. She'd work all day long, meet with her, so that's Sunday morning, right? Sunday morning to late Sunday evening. The taxi driver turns around, does the whole thing, and fortunately, she brought one of her employees with her on one of these trips, and he said, "So we get back on Monday morning, I'm exhausted, I'm ready for bed." She walked into the office. She went to work. So she very seldom spent the night at San Simeon. That's how she did it, is that she would sleep on the train. And in a way, it's fortunate that neither William Randolph Hearst nor Julia Morgan actually lived at San Simeon. It was his beloved ranch. He'd known and adored it all his life, but he very seldom spent more than maybe 4 or 5 weeks there, and she didn't even have a designated bedroom. She'd like to move around, see if the shaving mirror's in the right place, or the door creaked, or whatever, the rare times when she did stay overnight. But anyway, what that means is they corresponded. And that is a great gift to history. There are 10,000 drawings, and they are just like this. At the bottom, she has written to him, 1 bungalow. Yeah, right. Well, it didn't take long, as the man who overheard her say, he said within a month, they were going on the grand scale, which is really, that is her natural milieu. But anyway, they've got 3 of these cottages, and then the main building, a twin-towered building like a cathedral on the top of the hill. And she said, "Do you like this scheme?" And on the side, he's written right on the drawing. And what he said was, "Yes, Miss Morgan, I do, but I think," he was going to be in this right-hand house. He said, "I think we should take the arches from that house and move them to the middle," which was a house for his guests. And so that's what she did. But these 10,000 drawings and 2,468, I believe is the number, letters and telegrams that the 2 of them exchanged over 28 years, make an enormous and extraordinary resource. And so, in a way, what that man who's overheard, his name was Walter Stylberg, he called them both long-distance dreamers. He said when those two bent over a drawing, the rest of us could have been 100 miles away. He said you could almost see the spark move from one to the other of their foreheads, and those two very different people just clicked. And it is true that by building for Hearst, who was not the easiest of clients in lots of ways, I'll go into in a minute, but it put her in a very rarefied echelon. There are only two other American architects, Stanford White and Richard Morris Hunt. White, who did the great Newport homes and buildings in Long Island, and Richard Morris Hunt, who did the Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina, and the Breakers at Newport and Rhode Island. They're decades older than she is, and yet Julia is the only other architect working on such a scale. Now she's working with, this is that same building, right, that I just showed you. They named it for this view of the ocean, Casa del Sol. But she's working at concrete. Everything is still reinforced concrete. And incorporating antique and modern pieces, and it's all kind of this feeling of Spain and the Mediterranean. And these letters that we have between the two of them are wonderfully edifying. One of the first ones, W.R. writes to her, "Dear Miss Morgan, the main thing at the ranch is the view." And that this is the view of what I just showed you. That's what you're looking out at. So everything is oriented, to the west and to this magnificent ocean. And there's no doubt that Julia grew to love San Simeon as much as he did. Sometimes it was frustrating, but she knew it had importance, and she knew it would outlive them both. I told you the taxi driver was the one who would take her to and from the train station. Well, fortunately, he kept a diary. He was actually illiterate, but his family wrote it down about her very first trip, and that was in April of 1919. And so she got to the bottom of the hill. W.R. was waiting at the train station for her. And you can see, this it's still, as I said, it's the middle of nowhere. It's an enormous amount of land, isolated land. They got to the bottom of the hill at San Simeon, where there's a family ranch house, which the Hearst family still use. And there were two saddled horses standing there. She looks at him. She says, "I'm 47. I don't ride. That's not changing." And so what they did, W.R., who'd been born on a horse practically, he got on the horse. They put her in the taxi, kept her in the back seat. They hired, they called over a couple of cowboys who rode alongside and roped the bumper. And they climbed from sea level to 1,600 feet, avoiding the biggest of the rock outcroppings. It's absolutely extraordinary, So they were, in that sense, long-distance dreamers, but you can see how much it grew. 2 swimming pools and a total of enclosed square feet of 110,000. And of course, she's more than just the architect. She was also the landscape architect. She was also the interior designer. She didn't do the engineering as technology advanced. She seldom did her own engineering, but she knew how to do it, and she collaborated with the people who did. So it's an unbelievable amount of responsibility, all steel reinforced concrete, and to make it earthquake resistant, but looking as if Spain has, to some extent, by allowing me to change mine now and then. So it was difficult because, as you I'm sure know, William Randolph Hearst was an omnivorous collector. San Simeon represents 10% of his total art collections, and that's a stupefying percentage. But anyway, she's expected to take these objects, which are never the right size, and make them fit. Like the ceiling was a series of wall panels, but in this dining room, the refectory, she's mounted it as a ceiling of saints. The seats against the walls are from the 14th century cathedral, Seu de Urgell in Catalonia. They'd been taken out in a restoration because the church was consecrated in the 11th century, and these are 14th century. So Hearst was able to buy them. And it was between the world wars. That was the time to buy. So anyway, she's modifying objects. She's creating these suites for the upstairs rooms. This is called the Doge's suite. And the central painting by Vautevill, which is the Christ, the announcings of Christ's birth, it's Flemish. And that's 17th century, but the little panels around it are 18th century. And she didn't put them together, Stanford White did. So, she's having to deal with these very complex kind of picture puzzle pieces, even though it looks like he bought everything first and they laid it out in a field and then they made a big house. But actually, less than 5% of what's there was in his possession before 1920. So it's an amazing job, and they both knew that the landscape was the most important thing. And here you see she's done a drawing for it. It says feature for House B. They give alphabet letters to the 3 cottages. The center one was the sun. The northern one, House B, was the mountains. The southern one, House A, was the ocean. But anyway, these 2 figures look a lot like Julia Morgan and William Randolph Hearst. And they would confer in the garden. They're hauling up full-grown trees and tons of topsoil and creating this incredible landscape. And he owned this view. He ended up buying more and more land till it was 250,000 acres. And so just a magnificent setting. And then he's also has this enormous animal collection, largest private zoo in America at one point. And so she's writing him saying that the keeper says they need to buy some Icelandic moss for the reindeer. It's just, and this isn't even the most astonishing thing. I think her swimming pools are so extraordinary, and we don't even know if she knew how to swim. There's no evidence of it, but she understood what a water feature could mean in the history of architecture. So this is called the Roman plunge. The tennis courts on its roof are illuminating the platform for diving. There's stairs behind the walls, and it's all tile from Venice, 1-inch square pieces from Murano, and looks like a shining mirror, the most all lapis blue, so extraordinary. But that's not the only pool at San Simeon. It has 2. So that was the Roman plunge, they call it. This they call the Neptune pool, and it has this figure at the top of the temple, which was a 17th century statue of Neptune with 2 sea nymphs, and the 6 columns. You see their different heights? They're not from one building, but they are ancient Roman, about 1st century AD. And so it's not even a building. It's got a facade behind it, but she's creating a working swimming pool, heated year-round with kerosene oil, lit in the most magnificent way. They generate their own power, hydroelectrically at first, but they always had electricity and underground wiring. So it was a fantasy, and still is, I must say. And not only that, she's also building warehouses at the bottom of the hill, all the ranch buildings, which is what I was lecturing about in 2017. There's a dozen of them used every day still. And an estate village where Hearst employees still live. The workers on the ranch still live. And all of that was going on while she was having some of the most difficult times of her life. She was closest to her brother, second youngest brother. Avery was his name. He came to Paris and studied with her. But he was, what they said was he had nerves. What he ended up having was early onset Alzheimer's. And it was a tragedy, and Julia really supported him most of her adult life. And she tried to have him in her office as a draftsman, but it was too pressure. So he became her chauffeur and drove her around, and was prone to disappearing, as so often is the case. So she was always worried about Avery. She was worried about her eldest brother, Parmalee, who died, and we couldn't figure out from what, a very painful and extended death. It turned out, because my researcher found the documents finally, he died of neurosyphilis, and which was not only a heartbreak, but a scandal. And though he had a wife and daughter, it's Julia's name on his death certificate. Her mother ended up with, from the strain of this, having a stroke, and she didn't want to leave. Her father had died of a stroke, and she didn't want to leave. Eliza didn't want to leave that house she'd been in since 1887. So what they did, Julia had built a house for her younger sister, and they owned the lot next door in Berkeley. So what they did was she built this house, which has since been relocated, but it isn't a house. And they had Mrs. Morgan over for dinner, and then that evening they walked her next door and took her upstairs. They had put all the furniture, her furniture, in her room. There was a fire in the fireplace, and she never knew she'd moved. Which I think says a great deal about how she perceived architecture. Shelter in so many senses, not merely the obvious and practical one. Shelter and safety. And of course, she did a great many things for Marion Davies, who, was here in Rancho Mirage before she built the Desert Inn, right? Now, this is all post William Randolph Hearst. He died in her home in Beverly Hills in 1951 at 88. She was in her early 50s at the time. And but she, starting in 51, she came to Rancho Mirage, you know, the big property on Frank Sinatra Drive. It's now been restored. Well, it's now an event venue. It's called Villa de Martini, I think. But anyway, she built there. She owned the Desert Inn. She bought that in 1955. So she turned to this area, you know, as her kind of next wilderness development, you know, I mean, like her next San Simeon, adored this area. But that was all post-Julia and post-WR. But anyway, she did work on a very important building of Marion's, and it was what is now called the Annenberg Beach House, which fell down. It was Marion's ocean house, you know, at 415 Pacific Coast Highway. It fell down in the Northridge quake. It's been rebuilt and generously endowed by Wallace Annenberg. It's free, and what Julia designed was not the main house that you see here, but this gorgeous swimming pool in the front and the guest house just at the back. And those are the things that did the best during the earthquake, you know. So here it is, this fabulous kind of Georgian Hollywood combo, and this was for Marion's particular guests, and you can still tour it, and it certainly has its Hollywood moments, you know. And so she's building this from like 1927 through 28. In 1925 in Southern California, she builds this Hollywood Studio Club, which was specifically for actresses. Rita Moreno, Donna Reed, Marilyn Monroe, a safe place to live just off Hollywood Boulevard, still not functioning in that way, but still in use. But it was another YWCA. She built the Chinese YWCA with these beautiful Chinese motifs in San Francisco. Didn't ever charge for her work. She would donate her services so often to the YWCA. She built the YWCA in Pasadena on a very important corner, Marengo, you know, and it's been going back and forth about redevelopment. It is going to be restored, but at the moment it's in sad state, but it will come back to beauty. She also built, at least we're in the same county, the Riverside YWCA, which in 1967 became the Riverside Art Museum, with which you may be familiar. And when Phoebe's wind tune burned to the ground, which it did, WR said he wanted to build something else, and suddenly, at Windtune, she's building an entire compound, almost the size of San Simeon, in 3 separate areas with these fantastical, literally, fairy tale buildings. This is Cinderella House. And again, just like right out of Bavaria. And antler horn chandeliers and beer steins and beautiful forest. Hearst lived in Brown Bear House with Marion Davies. And they hired a children's book illustrator, Willie Pogany, to do the illustrations. I mean, to do the murals on the walls. So suddenly, I mean, it's too much. She's doing all of those things, plus more I can't even get into. You see her face drooping. She had a chronic problem with ear infections, and it got worse and worse. And she was forced to have a series of operations. Her mastoid process was severed, and she ended up with this deformed face, distorted face, and no equilibrium, which was a catastrophe for an architect. And yet she still continued to work. One time she fell into the rushing McCloud River when she was working at Windtune with no balance. One of the employees said to the other, most of us would throw ourselves into the ocean. But she kept going. The biggest project that she was not able to complete but dreamed of doing was this. WR did buy monasteries, Cistercian 12th century Spanish monasteries, and he gave the stones from one to the city of San Francisco. Julia designed this beautiful medieval museum, concrete, that would have been faced with the historic stones, and it would have held her art collection, medieval art collection. It was meant to go between the De Young Museum and the Japanese Tea Garden, but though Julia worked on it for 10 years, it never happened, and the stones actually were carried away, and many of them are still in Golden Gate Park. So it's a wonderful, might have been. Now, not that long ago, maybe 15 years ago, a Cistercian order, the Abbey of New Clairvaux, Our Lady of New Clairvaux, took these stones from the chapter house, which was the most elegant, and combined it. And this is in Vina, near Stockton. So one small portion was put to use, but obviously she never saw that. She could tell her powers were fading, and sadly, really sadly, she began to lose her memory. And she knew all too well, after her mother and Avery, what that portended. And eventually, she just closed down her practice. You see her here on the left saying, take the photo already, you know. The Japanese woman standing smiling is Sachioka, who started as a housekeeper of her little house in Monterey. Julia bought her a car and then bought her and her husband Kazuo a house after they'd been interned in the camps in Poston, Arizona. They were going to go to Detroit. Julia had been sending them things. They were going to go to Detroit to try to find work in the auto industry, and Julia said, I've bought you a house. Will you come home? So she was a person of extraordinary generosity, but in a way, she outlived her time, and she always wanted her buildings to speak for her. But I grew up in what could really be called Julia Morgan country in the North Berkeley Hills, literally surrounded by her buildings, and I'd never heard her name until I came to San Simeon as a visitor in 1978 and was told, a woman built this, but we don't know anything about her, which was the beginning of my lifetime love affair. Sadly, Citizen Kane cast a shadow because, it was Xanadu, it was set, it was supposed to be San Simeon, which had nothing to do with San Simeon, but people saw the film and realized that, thought that San Simeon was dark and gloomy as Xanadu was. And then modernism took over, San Simeon, W.R. died in 1951, and he had wanted his estate to go to the University of California. That's always been the plan. He knew it was not just for himself. And Julia knew it, too. She said the country needs museums of architecture, not just paintings, But anyway, when offered it as a gift, they turned it down. It was so expensive, not particularly popular style of architecture. That's how it became a state park. And about a year before it opened, Life magazine did a 14-page cover story, Neptune Pool on the cover, endless text about what everybody was going to be able to see. Julia Morgan's name was never mentioned. And in 1966, when the great architecture critic Joan Didion did an essay called Return to Xanadu. It was about nothing but her going to San Simeon as a child, coming back as an adult. How did she feel? The architecture. Julia Morgan's name was never mentioned. So, it has turned out that I have felt the great honor of telling this story, the importance of dreaming big, the importance of never giving up, and the importance of giving the due to someone who so richly deserves it. And it's been a great pleasure and a long journey for me to share this today. Thank you. Thank you. How nice. Thank you so much, everyone. Is there time? Do we have time for questions? Yes.
We'll take a few.
A couple? If anyone has them. I'm going to go sit over there, so you can always bring them also.
All right. Do we have any questions for Victoria?
There's one back at the back.
One back. Ruby's.
Oh, pardon me. Did Julia Morgan have anything to do with Villa dei Martini, which is what I've told you is the redeveloped Marion Davies home site that's now an event venue? No. Marion didn't buy it until 1951. By that time, Julia had closed her office because of her worsening dementia and was no longer doing any design work. So Marion only got involved with this area after W.R. died, from 1951 until she sold the Desert Inn at a profit in 1960. Those are the years when she was here, but that's all post-Hearst, post-Julia Morgan. Anyone else? Yes.
Thank you. Terrific.
Thank you.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
What kind of a business person was she in terms of setting her fee and all that kind of thing?
What kind of business person was she? Well, she was not a great business person. I mean, she was very successful. Her office had between 6 and 10 architects. It was called Julia Morgan Architect, But she would often donate her services. And when she died, her finances had gotten into arrears because of the cognitive problems she was experiencing, and they couldn't find her will, and they didn't think she had one, and they needed to get some money, so they sold her books, and that was a terrible loss. Her architecture library, and it turned out afterward they found the will, and she'd wanted them to go to UC Berkeley, So she was, in a funny way, she and W.R. really were kindred spirits. they didn't care anything about money. He didn't care about saving it. She didn't care about spending it. You know, I mean, they just, or vice, either way, they were about bigger things, much bigger things, dreaming big. And I think that's the message I want to leave you with. Thank you so much.
So just a reminder, Victoria will be signing, so just please line up along this wall here.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you so much. You did. You started this whole thing. You know, really touched my heart. It's true about my correspondence. I can follow Kastner all over the world.